Element 2, data use. In MTSS-R, data are used to make decisions to improve MTSS-R implementation and student outcomes. Two types of data are used for this: student data, which will be part 1 of this checklist, and MTSS-R implementation data, which is part 2 of the checklist. In this section of the MTSS-R checklist, there are 9 different sections. The first 5 sections cover student reading data, and then the last 4 sections cover implementation data. So let's look at these 2 types of data that are used to make decisions. And let's start with part 1, student data. We want to make sure that we have a comprehensive system of student reading data. We're going to use multiple data sources to answer essential questions. The first assessment type is universal screening, and the important question that the universal screening answers for us is, are students meeting key reading benchmarks, and which students are at risk? The next assessment type is progress monitoring, and the important question for progress monitoring is the student at risk making adequate progress in the intervention toward those end of grade level reading outcome goals. The next assessment type is diagnostic, and the important question that a diagnostic assessment will answer is, what specific skills has the student not making adequate progress mastered and not mastered? And then finally we have lesson mastery, and the important question for lesson mastery to answer for us is the student learning the instructional content just taught in the lesson? Another table looking at those 4 different types of student reading data shows us the type of data for each of those. Is it formative or summative? The timing, you can see we go all the way from 3 times a year with universal screening down to lesson mastery that's at the completion of a lesson. You can see the duration for the different kinds of assessments as well. With the universal screener, they're short, 1 to 2 minutes. Progress monitoring, short, 1 to 2 minutes. Diagnostic is a little bit longer. Those might take up to 2 minutes per measure, depending on the type of diagnostic that it is. And same with lesson mastery, depending on if it's during the lesson or at the end of the lesson. It could be anywhere from a minute to 10 minutes per measure. Let's look a little bit more at each of these assessments. We'll start with the universal screening. The purpose of screening is to identify those students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. Because RTI is a framework for providing services, the outcomes you are concerned about could be anything, such as academic achievement, behavior, graduation, or post-school outcomes. Sites, such as state, district, schools, typically identify what outcomes students are expected to achieve and then screen to see which students are not likely to achieve those outcomes. For example, if the desired outcome is graduation, a quick screen of attendance and credits, which are predictors of graduation, can reveal which students are not likely to meet the requirements of graduation and need additional support. If the desired outcome is mastery on end-of-year tests, student performance assessments like curriculum-based measurement can reveal which students are not likely to meet the end-of-year standards and need additional support. The focus of RTI is on all students, not just those students we may believe are at risk. Students may slip through the cracks unless there is a systematic process for screening in place. Screening is not diagnostic testing. It is brief, reliable, and valid assessment to identify which students may need additional assessments, such as progress monitoring or diagnostic assessments, or additional instructional support. The tool should demonstrate diagnostic accuracy for predicting learning or behavioral outcomes. In other words, they should be able to accurately identify who could be at risk. At a minimum, screening should be administered more than once per year, such as the beginning of the school year, the middle of the school year. Schools and districts that wish to use screening data to evaluate program effectiveness, to establish local norms and cut scores, and to provide data to the next year teacher typically choose to administer the screening assessment 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring, and should select a screening tool that provides alternative forms and multiple benchmarks. Here are some examples of measures on screening assessments. You might see letter naming fluency, letter sound fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, word identification fluency, nonsense word fluency, oral reading fluency, maze or maze fluency. This is not a table that shows all of the measures that are on all screening. It's just a sampling of some examples that you might see on a screening assessment. The National Center on Intensive Intervention has an academic screening tools chart that include the technical rigor of screening tools. It is a great resource to use as you are determining the tools that you will be using. Let's talk about progress monitoring now. The purpose of progress monitoring is to determine if students at risk are making that adequate progress in response to intervention. We want to focus on all students at risk for reading problems and then other students if it's needed. It's a brief assessment that are reliable and valid and sensitive to progress over time. You want to have regular administration, so that's normally weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, depending on the students. Progress monitoring measures work well when they are aligned with the screening assessment. They are used more frequently, so multiple comparable forms are needed. The measures should be aligned to students' areas of difficulty, for instance, decoding or reading fluency. Progress monitoring goals should be set to determine whether students are making that adequate progress toward those end-of-year goals. This is an example of weekly progress monitoring on an individual student's words read correctly. You can eyeball progress, calculate slope to determine progress, and use the goal line as a judge of progress within and across students. The graph on the left shows a student with sharply increasing scores. The increasing scores may indicate the student is responding to his or her current instructional program. The graph on the right shows a student with fairly flat CBM scores. The flatter scores may indicate that the student is not responding to his or her current instruction, and perhaps an instructional change for the student should occur. However, a visual inspection of the data points is not sufficient to tell us if the student is making adequate progress. To be sure, we can quantify a rate of improvement. With this rate of improvement, we can compare the student's growth rate to his or her peers or to a local or national norm. We can see the one on the left is improving 6 words read correctly. The one on the right is at 0.3 words read correctly. Progress monitoring data can also identify students not making adequate progress with an intervention. Ideally, we use specific decision rules to decide which students are not making adequate progress. We can see improvement by looking at trend lines in comparison to their goal lines. On the graph on the left, the trend line is steeper than the goal line. The student is showing increasing scores, therefore the student is making adequate progress, and the end-of-year goal may need to be adjusted to provide more of a challenge. On the graph at the right, the trend line is flatter than the goal line. The student is not profiting from the instruction, and therefore the teacher needs to make a change in instructional program. Remember, you never lower the goal. Instead, the instructional program should be tailored to bring a student's scores up so the scores match or surpass the goal line. Let's take a look at diagnostic assessments. The purpose of diagnostic assessments is to identify specific literacy skill strengths and weaknesses to inform intervention intensification. Students identified through screening or progress monitoring as at risk for poor literacy skill acquisition and are not making adequate progress are the focus for the diagnostic assessments. The tools are longer assessments, often standardized, also quicker, less standardized assessments. Psychometric quality varies with diagnostics. The time frame are for that students are assessed on an as-needed basis. When do we need more information? What are the keys to the diagnostic assessments? They assess or diagnose instructional need. They do not diagnose disabilities or dyslexia. The increased specificity to tap individual student strengths and weaknesses. They should provide data on areas of instruction to be intensified for an individual student. They can be standardized, available through publishers, or informal, created by teachers. They can also be combined with multiple data sources, for example, parent feedback, to narrow in on instruction need. Some examples of diagnostic assessments would be core phonics screeners, which would be, or generic phonics screeners, phonological awareness skills test, or teacher-made phonics assessments. All right, let's look at lesson mastery now. The purpose of lesson mastery is to identify lesson components where the learner has reached a mastery level of proficiency. All students who receive the lesson, especially critical to collect for students at risk, should be the focus for lesson mastery. The tools are brief assessments that are either curriculum embedded or proximal to lesson content. The time frame, shortly after completion of a lesson or within a lesson, and interwoven throughout the year to ensure retention of mastery level proficiency. How does lesson mastery data fit within your MTSS-R system? So as you see in the middle, you're going to use your universal screening data to determine tiers of instruction for each student. Your student are going to follow the tiers of instruction plan, teachers delivering explicit and systematic instruction. You'll be collecting progress monitoring data from students at risk for reading problems to see if they're making adequate growth. At the same time, you'll be collecting lesson mastery data from all students to determine mastery level of proficiency of the lessons as they're being taught. Then, each month, you'll be reviewing the student data and determine specific instructional adjustments needed for groups or individuals. The lesson mastery data spans all tiers of instruction and intervention. It's unique because it's narrowly focused on assessing for student understanding of lesson content. It is not a general outcome measure, so it's not like an oral reading fluency, and it does not necessarily have to meet psychometric standards for reliability and validity. Lesson mastery data may be packaged with curricula or teacher created. It may be collected during instruction, for instance, error data, or after instruction. It should have high confidence that students can respond correctly to 85% of the items on the assessment. and it should be delivered with consistency and linked with alterable instruction. What instructional adjustments need to happen? When choosing an appropriate lesson mastery tool to track student progress, consider what skills the assessment is measuring. For instance, is it phonological awareness, phonics, fluency with connected text, vocabulary, comprehension? And 2, how will you use the data to inform instruction? Here's an example of something that is used during instruction. A teacher could collect daily lesson mastery by recording errors that are made during the lesson. If you're checking for understanding and an error is made, you can record those errors on a lesson mastery data sheet. So teachers could record data on specific sounds or words that have not been mastered during the lesson. The recorded errors can then be retaught at the end of each lesson and at the start of the next lesson. Here's another example of lesson mastery data collected during instruction. This is collecting information on accuracy and fluency of connected text reading that's gathered while students are reading decodable text. A teacher records data on the extent to which students can apply the sounds and words they have just been taught to reading connected text. Consistent accuracy errors indicate the need to reteach specific sound spellings or blending skills. Consistent fluency errors indicate the need to provide additional practice reading in decodable text. Dictation would be another way that you could collect lesson mastery during instruction. Teacher has students use paper and pens to collect dictation data at least one time a week to determine which students can apply the sounds to written words that have just been taught. Consistent accuracy errors indicate the need to reteach specific sound spellings or segmenting skills. Now let's talk about lesson mastery data that's collected after instruction. So end of unit assessment from core curriculum is one example. These assessments generally require reading skills, and they are most appropriate for students who are at or above benchmark. The teacher collects data on how well students have mastered the skills within that unit. Errors indicate the need to reteach specific skills. Results can also indicate areas of instruction to adjust or improve when moving on to the next unit of instruction. Another one for after instruction is an end of unit teacher created assessment that accurately assesses mastery of unit content. The teacher collects data on how well students have mastered the skills within a unit. Errors indicate the need to reteach specific skills, and results can also indicate areas of instruction to adjust or improve when moving on to the next unit of instruction. Other alternatives to students who may struggle with the packaged core program assessments would be a vocabulary example, displaying weekly vocabulary words without the definition, students writing the word that means, and you give them the definition. Students write the vocabulary word that matches that definition. Teacher groups identify core program worksheets that students complete at the end of each week or unit that can accurately assess content mastery. Please remember to use the lesson mastery results. The tools are narrowly focused on assessing for student understanding of lesson content. The assessment should be delivered with consistency. You should have a plan within your building on what lesson mastery tools you're using and how they're being used. And the big idea, results should be linked with alterable instruction. What instructional adjustments need to happen as a result of the current data? Data can be used to make instructional decisions for individual students or groups of students. For example, daily, if one student in a group of 5 is struggling to master a skill, you may choose to reteach the skill to just that student for a few minutes at the end of each lesson. Also daily, if all 5 students are struggling with one or more skills, you may choose to reteach just those routines to the whole group at the end of the lesson and at the beginning of the next lesson before moving on. And then weekly, if all students are struggling with many skills at the end of the week, you may choose to immediately reteach one lesson before moving on to the next week. Now let's look at the MTSS-R implementation data. What gets implemented within this MTSS-R system? You have reading instruction and intervention, you have professional development and coaching, and you have school MTSS-R leadership. Data on the implementation of each of these elements should be collected and used to improve implementation and outcomes. Let's look at instruction and intervention implementation data. Implementation data in tiers 1, 2, and 3 should be collected systematically. The goal is to assess the difference between what is expected and observed during instruction. 3 types of data are frequently collected. The first 2 are completed by an observer. It's direct data collection while watching reading instruction in the classroom, or collecting surveys and ratings based on watching reading instruction in the classroom. The third one is completed by the staff that's delivering the reading instruction, and that's a log of what has been taught. Let's look at the types of instruction and intervention implementation data. There's fidelity of implementation, quality of implementation, evidence-based instructional practices, and instruction and intervention intensity. I'm going to cover these in the next few slides. For fidelity of implementation, we're going to look at the instructional areas. For instance, irregular word reading, phonemic awareness, sound spelling instruction, etc. We want to look, are all of the components being delivered within the reading lesson, and are they being delivered as they were intended to be delivered? We also want to look at the quality of implementation. So going back to those explicit elements, is there an explanation stating the objective? Is the teacher including models to demonstrate to the students what the learning looks like? Are all students practicing? Is appropriate pacing being used? Is the teacher checking for understanding and providing immediate error corrections? Should also be collecting data on the evidence-based instructional practices, community of positive learning, organization of instructional materials, classroom management, student participation, motivational strategies, and instructional scaffolding. You can also collect information on instruction and intervention intensity by recording the number of group responses, individual responses, academic feedback, and student errors, and determining if it's appropriate for the learning of students. Let's quickly look at PD and coaching implementation data. You want to consider ways to collect both quantity and quality data related to PD and coaching services. So number 1, collect that PD and coaching quantity and quality data from recipients of the services and also the providers of the services. But also have PD and coaching providers keep logs of the services they provide. Who are they providing them to? What? When, where, why, and how. Here's an example of a PD coaching and implementation data form that could be collected at the end of each activity for PD and coaching. Let's look at MTSS-R leadership implementation data. Again, consider ways to collect quantity and quality data. So you can collect MTSS-R school-based teams' quantity and quality data from members of the team, and also have members keep logs or the minutes of the meetings. So who's at the meeting, what happened at the meeting, when did it happen, why, how, what were the processes that you used. So you can collect MTSS-R team meeting implementation data by logging or keeping meeting minutes, and also collecting meeting surveys. And that is the same with your PLC or grade level team meetings. You can collect meeting minutes and meeting survey data. The information from these minutes and the survey data should then be used for improving the effectiveness of those team meetings. All right, let's move on to evaluate and score data use. You will have your items for each of the sections. Make sure you're having quality discussions within your team to determine the rating of each of those items, and then also making any discussion notes. Work with your team, score each section. There are 9 sections for the data use element. So spend time making sure that you have scores for each of the sections in this element, and then come back and we'll do element 3.